She laughed at me and told me to get a real career. 5 minutes later, I quietly ended her $156,000 salary. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to Roots of Revenge, like this video, and comment what you would have done if you were in my place, because this story is about betrayal, pride, and the kind of quiet power that people never see coming. The restaurant that night was glowing under soft chandeliers, warm candlelight reflecting off crystal glasses, and the air smelled faintly of roses and roasted garlic. A perfect setting for what everyone assumed would be a polite, happy birthday dinner for my mother. My mother sat at the head of the long table, smiling graciously, her eyes catching the light in a way that made her look untouchable, surrounded by close friends, family, and a few familiar faces from her social circle who had come to celebrate her. I was there quietly, observing, sipping my drink, letting the warmth of the room wash over me, trying not to feel the familiar sting of my sister's presence, because anyone who knew her knew she had a way of dominating a room without raising her voice. Of course, she arrived late, fashionably late, as always, heels clicking on the marble floor like a drumbeat announcing her arrival, perfume announcing her presence before she even smiled. She greeted my mother with over-the-top warmth, barely noticing me as she leaned past for a cursory kiss on the cheek, her energy filling the space with sharp laughter and confidence that felt more like conquest than joy. Within minutes, she was in full swing, talking about her latest deal at work, dropping names, numbers, and statistics as though every syllable was meant to prove her worth, and everyone around the table nodded, complimented, and laughed at the right moments. Then someone asked me what I'd been working on, a simple, casual question meant to make polite conversation, and before I could answer, she laughed. Not cruelly at first, just lightly, almost musical, but enough to draw attention away from me and onto her. "Oh, don't encourage him. He's still doing that little online thing, aren't you?" she said, tilting her head and flashing a smile that was half amusement, half dismissal. The table chuckled softly, not maliciously, but just enough to make me feel that familiar burn of being belittled. I smiled politely and said, "I'm building a media company," and she laughed again, more sharply this time, and said, "Sweetie, that's not a career, that's a phase. You should really get a real job." The word real landed heavier than I expected, and the room seemed to pause for a moment. My mother's smile flickered slightly, her hand tightening around her wine glass, and I felt eyes shift, guests leaning in just slightly, the subtle tension of polite observation. I looked directly at my sister and said softly, "You mean like yours?" Her smile widened. She leaned back and said, "Yes, like mine. A real salary, real responsibility, not chasing clicks and views." Calmly, I asked, "How much is it now?" Her pride was evident as she said, 156, and I repeated, 156,000. She added, "Base salary, bonuses on top." I smiled slowly and said, "That's impressive," letting the words linger in the air while she leaned back, satisfied with herself, not realizing she had just handed me the key to what was about to happen. The conversation drifted to other topics. The birthday cake arrived, candles flickering, applause and laughter filling the room again, and no one noticed me quietly pulling out my phone, opening the secure folder I rarely touched, and accessing the contract with her name on it, a document she thought she had no idea existed. I had acquired the media firm she worked for through a shell company years ago, letting her think she was working independently, earning her salary from her own skill and charm, when in reality, every paycheck came from me. She didn't know, no one knew, and that secrecy made the power deliciously quiet. As she laughed across the table at some story she was telling, I typed a single message to my legal team. "Terminate executive contract effective immediately, clause 14. I pressed send. Nothing shook, nothing fell. The chandeliers still sparkled, her laughter still rang, but the world had subtly shifted. I finished my drink, hugged my mother, wished her a happy birthday again, and stepped out into the night air, calm and collected, knowing that the seed of change had been planted. The next morning, my sister's phone rang 6 times before I even noticed, voicemails piling up, her voice tense, confused, a mixture of fear and disbelief, and I didn't answer immediately. I let her sit in that quiet panic, letting her realize the invisible thread she had mocked was actually mine to cut. When I finally listened to the first voicemail, her voice was clipped, controlled, and she didn't know where to begin. And that was the moment I understood The next morning, the reality of what had happened at my mother's birthday settled over me like a weight I hadn't expected, quiet but persistent, and I could already imagine the shock running through my sister as she realized her world had shifted without warning. She called repeatedly, each ring a tiny hammer against my nerves, a reminder of the power I held silently while everyone thought the night had been just another party. I didn't answer immediately, letting her frustration and disbelief build, letting her sit with the fear that comes when control is suddenly stripped away, and when I finally listened to her first voicemail. Her voice trembled slightly, clipped, forced to maintain composure she hadn't yet found. I don't understand. What happened? Who approved? And she trailed off, panic creeping into every syllable. I stayed silent, letting her words echo in my head, savoring the calm realization that humiliation doesn't need to be loud to be effective. It was not cruelty that motivated me, not revenge in the traditional sense, but clarity, showing her that arrogance and belittlement carry consequences, and that underestimating people quietly building power is the gravest mistake someone can make. The day continued, but the world felt different. I checked my phone, seeing emails confirming termination, final paycheck adjusted, HR notes reflecting the immediate change, all procedural, all quiet, all invisible to the casual observer, yet monumental to her. My sister texted in rapid succession, a flurry of questions and pleas, trying to grasp how everything she had counted on could unravel without warning, trying to call me, to reason, to negotiate, but all her messages met with measured silence. I allowed myself a small, deep breath, watching from a distance as the first ripples of panic and disbelief hit the people around her, when they eventually noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the confident armor she wore at the dinner, now cracking in private spaces where no one but me could see. I reflected on the irony that the very salary she had flaunted moments before, the $156,000 she used as proof of her real career, now existed solely because of me, and in that truth I found an almost poetic justice, not cruelly shouted to the world, but carefully, quietly administered. Calls from friends and colleagues started trickling in as she sought answers, her voice strained and defensive, trying to mask the humiliation she felt, trying to convince herself it was some administrative error or a technical glitch, and each attempt was met with patience on my side and growing panic on hers, a silent demonstration that power wielded without arrogance speaks louder than confrontation. Even my mother, still basking in the afterglow of her birthday, began noticing small things. The hesitation in my sister's tone when she recounted her day, the falter in her laughter during brunch, and she asked me quietly if something had happened, and I simply shook my head, letting the narrative unfold naturally, letting the consequences of underestimating someone who had quietly built control reveal themselves without commentary. I spent the day reflecting, replaying the prior night, and realizing that family gatherings, even ones bathed in candlelight and laughter, are battlegrounds for pride, ego, and perception. That humiliation delivered in words can sting, but humiliation delivered through quiet, untraceable action carries far longer echoes. My sister, unaware of how her salary was tied to me, had assumed superiority, assumed leverage, assumed that her role and the applause she collected were permanent fixtures in a world she didn't fully understand. And now, by the time evening arrived, the first real cracks began to show in her carefully curated public persona. Colleagues noticed the sudden change in her access, her confidence, and her ability to make decisions independently, while I remained calm, invisible in influence, but omnipresent in consequence. Each message she sent became increasingly desperate, pleading, negotiating, begging. And yet every response I withheld was part of the point. She had always believed that control was external, that power came from titles, salaries, applause, and visibility, And now she was learning the quietest truth. That influence, the kind that shapes lives, often comes from behind the curtain, invisible until the moment it lands. I thought about the irony of it all. The very words she had used to belittle me at dinner, the sharp dismissal of my work as a phase, the mocking laugh about my career, had all contributed to the clarity and decisiveness I now exercised. And I realized that confrontation doesn't need fireworks to be impactful. Subtlety and timing are far more devastating. And yet, in the midst of it all, I felt no joy in her panic, no glee in her fear. Instead, I felt calm, measured, a kind of emotional equilibrium, because power. By the time the news reached the office and her colleagues, the shift was subtle but undeniable. Whispers followed her down the hall, eyes lingered longer than usual, and invitations she had taken for granted vanished without explanation, leaving her to grasp at fragments of control she no longer possessed. I watched from a distance as her carefully curated confidence began to unravel, not dramatically in public, but in small, telling ways. Hesitations in meetings, pauses in conversations, even a faint tremor in her voice when she answered routine questions. All evidence that the invisible power I held had become terrifyingly real. Friends and acquaintances reached out to me quietly, asking if I had heard about the sudden changes, unsure of whether it was scandal, mismanagement, or something more deliberate, and I let them speculate, remaining calm, letting the ripple effect of controlled influence spread naturally, without interruption. My sister, now aware that her salary and position had been entirely contingent on someone she had dismissed and mocked, spiraled between disbelief, indignation, and a creeping sense of humiliation that she could not shake. Each text she sent, each voicemail, became more desperate than the last, her words clumsy in panic. "Please, this has to be a mistake. I don't understand how this happened. Call me, we need to fix this." And each one landed silently in my inbox, unanswered, as if the space itself were a mirror, reflecting back the arrogance she had displayed the night before. I thought about the strange, quiet satisfaction that comes not from revenge, but from the inevitability of consequence. The moment when someone realizes that their assumptions about permanence, about superiority, were fragile from the start. My mother, initially oblivious, eventually began noticing the subtle shift in her other daughter's demeanor. The unease in the way she spoke on the phone, the tightness of her laugh, the way she no longer dominated the dinner conversation as she had for years. And she finally asked me, in private, "Did something happen?" I only shook my head, letting the moment unfold, letting the lesson land on its own. Because some truths cannot be forced. They must be realized, painfully, deliberately. Meanwhile, I focused on the other side of the ripple, myself, my calm, and the quiet pride in knowing that patience and foresight often wield greater power than confrontation or rage. Friends and family who had been witnesses to the prior night's humiliation slowly began to understand the reversal, the subtle shift of influence, and their whispers carried both shock and admiration, though none of them fully comprehended the silent mechanisms that had enabled it. My sister, meanwhile, attempted damage control, calling in favors, leaning on colleagues, trying to assert influence that was now gone, and each effort only served to highlight her dependence on a foundation she had never acknowledged. I realized that watching someone like her learn this lesson, not publicly, not with spectacle, but quietly, profoundly, and permanently, was a strange mix of empathy and inevitability. She had built her identity on assumptions that were no longer true, and now she had to reckon with the fragility of her own pride. The world outside continued obliviously, unaware that the very salary she had flaunted at dinner, the sense of accomplishment she had displayed, had always been contingent, and that recognition, whether from friends, colleagues, or family, was never hers to control. As the days passed, the weight of the lesson grew heavier on her, each conversation a reminder, each glance a confirmation, and I reflected on how subtle action often outpaces anger, how the quietest moves can be the loudest in their lasting effects, and how understanding the invisible threads of power is more important than shouting from the rooftops. My sister's desperation morphed into reflection. a hesitant acknowledgement that perhaps she had been blind to forces outside her perception, a recognition that arrogance can create vulnerability even when it is cloaked in confidence, and even though she did not yet admit it aloud, I could sense it in her faltering tone, in the way she now approached colleagues and friends with care instead of bravado. I too considered my own journey, realizing that the power I had exercised was not born from cruelty, but from patience, planning, and foresight, and that the quiet satisfaction of influence, of watching consequences land without fanfare, carries a deeper resonance than revenge delivered through spectacle. And yet, I also understood the fragile nature of pride, both hers and mine, that every action we take leaves a mark, and that the echo of this moment would ripple through our family for years, shaping perceptions, relationships, and the understanding of what it means to be underestimated. In the background, my media company continued its operations, unaware of the. By the time the week ended, the quiet ripple of what had happened at my mother's birthday had become impossible to ignore. Whispers followed my sister wherever she went. Friends and colleagues who had once admired her confidence now exchanged awkward glances, noticing subtle cracks in her composure that had never been there before. And I watched the unfolding storm from a distance, calm, as the consequences of arrogance revealed themselves fully. My mother noticed, too, though she tried not to show it, the shift in the energy at home, the hesitation in her other daughter's tone, the carefully measured words she now chose, and for the first time she looked at me not just with pride, but with a hint of recognition, understanding that sometimes power is exercised quietly, invisibly, and irreversibly. The media, once oblivious to our family affairs, began picking up on small details, a rumor about a sudden resignation, a note about a high-ranking executive being removed without explanation. And though they did not know the full story, the public perception began to shift, admiration quietly turning to curiosity, speculation, and, in some corners, awe. My sister's attempts to repair her image were clumsy. Emails that once commanded attention now received delayed responses. Calls went unanswered, and she struggled to regain footing in spaces that had been hers for years, realizing painfully that status built on perceived permanence is fragile when its foundation is unseen. She tried to reach me multiple times, her voice oscillating between anger, pleading, and disbelief, and I remained composed, listening, occasionally responding in measured tones, because this was not about revenge. It was about letting someone understand the weight of their words and the vulnerability of their assumptions, the invisible debts that arrogance can create. My friends reached out privately, commenting on the audacity of the situation, the precision of the timing, the way subtle influence can override spectacle, and I began to notice something even more profound. The lessons of the event were spreading beyond just our family, a quiet example of accountability, of power, of consequence, and of the strange satisfaction that comes from acting deliberately, without theatrics, while others scramble to comprehend the sudden shift. In the evenings, I reflected on the events with a strange mixture of satisfaction and empathy. Satisfaction that justice, subtle and precise, had been served, and empathy for someone learning the consequences of arrogance, for someone realizing that the life they assumed was unshakable was actually contingent on forces they had ignored or dismissed. Over the following weeks, my sister's interactions with colleagues, friends, and family continued to reveal the weight of the lesson. Pauses became longer, laughter more cautious, confidence tempered by the new understanding that control can be fragile, and that the foundations of her world had never been as solid as she believed. At home, my mother and I developed a new quiet rhythm, a shared understanding of what had happened, and while she occasionally asked questions about how I managed the situation so discreetly, I simply smiled, knowing that some victories are best silent, their effects lasting far longer than any public confrontation ever could. Even my sister's social circles began noticing, friends remarking subtly on changes in behavior, on hesitations, on signs of a person learning humility in real time, and though none of them fully grasped the invisible hand behind it, they felt the shift, the quiet authority that had acted without fanfare, but with precision. In private, my sister finally acknowledged, hesitantly, that perhaps she had misjudged her understanding of influence, and that arrogance had its price, though the words were careful, restrained, and still tinged with residual pride, and I accepted that. The lesson, I realized, did not need full admission to be fully delivered. And as I looked at the larger picture, family dynamics subtly changed, colleagues recalibrating expectations, friends quietly observing the fallout, I understood the depth of the impact. Sometimes the most effective confrontations are invisible, precise, and personal, teaching lessons in ways that are unforgettable without ever needing spectacle. I reflected also on myself, on how patience, foresight, and quiet confidence can yield results more powerful than any loud declaration, and how carefully orchestrated action, rather than impulsive confrontation, can shift relationships and perceptions permanently, creating a lasting ripple effect that reshapes reality in subtle but undeniable ways. In the aftermath, I realized that true power does not shout. It moves silently, deliberately, shaping outcomes while letting others grapple with consequences. And in that truth lies both justice and satisfaction, a quiet confidence that lasts long after emotions fade. My sister's world,